Peter Stursberg was born in China in 1913. His mother was half Japanese and half Irish, and his father was a member of the colonial administration, the British colonial administration in China. So he grew up in a curious kind of imperial household of mixed race, and ultimately ended up in Canada when he was very early 20s and started his career as a journalist. He had become one of the very first people working for the CBC News. This is around 1938, and the CBC had just set up a news department. And of course, like he would have been at the time in 1938, 25 years old, say. So like everybody, every journalist of the period, when the war broke out, the number one thing they wanted to do was they wanted to go to cover the war. So finally in 1942, they agreed to send him, and in early 1943, he arrived in London. He covered them first of all in the invasion of Sicily, and then as they progressed up Italy and across the so-called Hitler line, so he followed the Canadian troops all through Italy. Then he followed the Canadian troops for the liberation of Holland, and then he ended up in Berlin just shortly after VE Day. And through the course of it all, of course, what he was doing was he was reporting on how the war was going from the point of view of Canada. And so it was the first time that people could actually hear what war sounded like. There's a famous piece of my father broadcasting from the Leary line in Italy, where you can hear him say, "Listen to the guns roar."
Just listen to those guns roar.
And then you hear the guns in the background. So it was actually allowed, and the Canadians were the only ones who had this technology, it actually allowed the Canadians to bring people into the sound of the war in a way that had never happened before.
We're in the attic of an old Italian farmhouse that overlooks the front as it's on a slight ridge. I'm standing here looking out of a hole in the wall that was made by a shell during the fighting here 2 days ago. This house, though, hasn't really been very badly damaged. It's the only one standing that I've seen for miles around.
Peter Stursberg landing in Sicily was the first time a Canadian broadcaster had covered Canadian troops on the move. He arrived just in time to cover the liberation of one of the key objectives of the Canadian force that landed in Sicily, the town of Agira, which was liberated in late July 1943. And so he came basically the evening of the battle and was able to get there when the town square had been liberated, and the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada pipe band was playing, the church bells in the background. It was able to broadcast for the first time Canadians liberating a European city. After years of really bad news in the wartime news coming from the CBC and elsewhere, this was quite an event. During the Second World War, radio was the only electronic media. There was print reporting, there was certainly newsreel and film that had been around for some time, and photographic reporting was certainly available. But radio was at the cutting edge of technology. It was a way to bring, with only a few hours delay in some cases, or at the least a day or more, a delay, reporting of real live sounds from the battlefield into people's living rooms in a way that had never been the case before. This was done through very bulky, by today's standards, portable recording units that weighed dozens of pounds each, that were carted on a Jeep that could then be brought to a mobile recording van and all of this sort of thing. But the result was that broadcasters like Stursberg were able to lay live commentary over events as they happened.
It's a great honor for the School of Journalism and Communication to host the annual Peter Stursberg Foreign Correspondence Lecture. We're in the business here of training young journalists, and down the road, some of them will likely end up reporting from conflict zones. The Stursberg Lecture Series is one way of ensuring that when they do, the journalism they produce will be smart and meaningful. Hearing from the best of today's foreign correspondents can't help but inspire journalists of the future to do their best, and hopefully their journalism will also contribute to more informed decision-making around the world.
Welcome to the 8th Annual Peter Stursberg Foreign Correspondence Lecture, hosted by Carleton University's School of Journalism and Communication in partnership with CBC Ideas. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Carleton University, where I'm located today, is situated on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I would encourage you, wherever you find yourself today, to take some time to think about the land you occupy. My name is Alan Thompson. I'm the director of the School of Journalism and Communication here at Carleton University. The Stursberg is one of our major keynote events, named for legendary war correspondent Peter Stursberg, and meant to examine the nexus between journalism and conflict. This year, faced with the gravity of the Israel-Gaza conflict and the crucial role of journalists in bearing witness and shaping the narrative, we decided to hold a lecture series. Today's installment is with the award-winning Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, a columnist with the newspaper Haaretz, who is joining us from Tel Aviv. Yesterday, we heard from Palestinian journalist Nahlah Ayed, who joined us from Gaza. Peter Stursberg was among the first to cover Canada's troops in the field during the Second World War. The war correspondents of his generation innovated in many ways to tell that story to Canadians. But many also complained after the fact about the pressure they faced to support the troops and comply with military censorship. It was very clear that those correspondents were expected to be on the team. Indeed, they had officer rank and wore uniforms. Something tells me Gideon Levy would not have been very comfortable with that situation. At a time when it remains controversial for many, he has used terms like genocide and ethnic cleansing when writing about Israel's military campaign in Gaza. And for decades, he's used his journalism to document the situation of Palestinians living under occupation. It's an honor for us to be joined today by a journalist as courageous as Gideon in the face of what must be incredible pressure. In a metaphorical sense, in keeping with the title of this lecture series, you could say that Gideon Levy is dying to tell the story, a story that some of his compatriots don't want to hear. Peter Stursberg was in the vanguard of Canadian war correspondence in a very different time. He used the latest technology of the day to infuse his radio reports with the sound of the battlefield in the Second World War, and to bring Canadians closer to those events. He was the last living Canadian correspondent from the Second World War when he passed away at the age of 101 in 2014. His children, Judith Lowry and Richard Stursberg, created two initiatives with Carleton's journalism program to honor their father. The first is the Peter Stursberg Award in Conflict Journalism and Media Studies. This award was intended to help a student in Carleton's Master of Journalism program complete a thesis or journalism project. This year, MJ student Sarah St. Pierre is using the award to support her research on the concept of conflict writ large involving Indigenous communities and mining companies. The second initiative created by the Stursberg family is an endowment in support of today's event, the annual Peter Stursberg Foreign Correspondence Lecture. Over the years, we've heard from some incredible correspondents: Lise Doucette, Janine De Giovanni, Adrian Arsenault, Larry Madowo, Naima El-Bahar, Giancarlo Fiorelli from Bellingcat, and last year, Veronika Melkazarova from Ukraine. Because this lecture celebrates the legacy of Peter Stursberg's work as a war correspondent, I'd like to invite Richard Stursberg, Peter's son, to join us now on behalf of the Stursberg family to say a few words. Richard.
Well, just thank you, Alan, and just to say that I'm very pleased that this talk in honor of my father is now in its 8th year, and as you said, we've had enormously distinguished speakers. Today is no exception. I'm thrilled that Gideon Levy is with us here today. I also would like to thank the journalism school and you, Alan, particularly for keeping this going, and certainly Ideas, which has been a wonderful partner and ensures that people who cannot attend today can hear an edited version of the lecture on the program. My thanks also to Nahlah Ayed, who has been the host of these talks for 6 years, I think now, Nahlah, and who's done a wonderful job. So I just say thanks. It continues to go on, and I thank you that this, I think, would have been exactly the kind of thing that my father would have wanted as a kind of tribute to his memory. So thank you very much, Alan.
Thanks, Richard. And through you, let me thank your family for your support for the award and this lecture. As you mentioned, the moderator of today's event is one of Canada's best-known foreign correspondents and public intellectuals, the CBC's Nahlah Ayed. Nahlah was born in Winnipeg to Palestinian parents and spent part of her childhood in the Middle East. Later, she worked for the Canadian Press, and I'm proud to say she's also a graduate of Carleton's Master of Journalism program. In 2002, Nahlah joined the CBC and reported from Amman, Baghdad, Beirut, and across the region, and later spent close to a decade covering world events from London. In 2012, she published her award-winning memoir, 1,000 Farewells. She's now the host of CBC Radio's nightly program, Ideas, which is a partner in this event and hopes to rebroadcast parts of this lecture series. Nahlah, we're so lucky to have you with us today. Nahlah will formally introduce our guest speaker, engage Gideon in a conversation following the presentation, and then take your questions. And just a reminder to those who are watching on YouTube, please use the QR code to reach the Slido app where you can pose your questions. And with that, I would like to turn this over to our moderator, Nahlah Ayed. Nahlah.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you, Richard. Thanks for a great introduction, and thank you for making all of this possible. It is a real honor to be back here for a 6th year, as you said, Richard, for one of the most important events on the journalism calendar. And it is an honor to be a moderator again for the 2024 Stursberg Lecture. And so without further ado, let me introduce our second 2024 Stursberg Lecturer. Gideon Levy is a columnist with Haaretz, a leading Israeli newspaper published in both Hebrew and English. He began his career as a journalist in 1974 as a reporter and editor with Army Radio, the radio network of the Israeli Defense Forces. In the late 1970s and early 80s, he served as an aide and spokesman for then opposition leader Shimon Peres. Today, his columns are deeply critical of the Israeli occupation, the government's approach to Gaza, and its conduct of the war since the Hamas attacks of October 7th, 2023. And relevant to today's lecture, he is also fiercely critical of the Israeli mainstream media. His own newspaper says, quote, he does not hesitate to express unpopular views against Israel's policies, which often draw heavy criticism from readers and the general public. Gideon Levy, as mentioned, joins us from Tel Aviv. Welcome, Gideon, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Nahlah. Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you very much, Richard. I was really moved to see this video. I'm really privileged to be here today. I wish I could meet your father, Richard, but I guess even though he lived so long, I didn't make it, and I'm sorry for this. I guess we could interest one the other because we are really two different generations with two different attitudes toward journalism, but I guess we would have also found a lot of common language between us. And thank you for hosting me here tonight. I would like just to say one or two sentences about myself before I start, just to give an idea of what am I doing. Because people tend to think that I'm covering the Palestinians, that I'm an expert for Palestinians, for Palestinian politics. Not at all. I don't even speak their language, unfortunately. So I tried, but I don't even speak their language. What I am doing for the last 36 years is covering us, Israelis. I'm covering the Israeli occupation for, first of all, Israeli readership, to tell them what is being done on their behalf, to tell them what is being done by our sons and the friends of our sons and the sons of our friends in an ongoing occupation which is now over 50 years old and shows no signs to come to its end. On the contrary, the end of the Israeli occupation is today farther than ever, and we will not get into it because that's not the topic of our lecture today. But I would like to say just in the beginning, without the collaboration of the Israeli media with the occupation, I deeply believe that the Israeli occupation wouldn't have lasted so long. It's not that the Israeli media is running the occupation. It's not even that the Israeli media is supporting the occupation, by all means not. But the Israeli media was and is the biggest collaborator with the narratives of the occupation, with the lies of the occupation, and above all, with the hiding of the occupation in Israeli public opinion and consciousness. And this is unforgivable. And I think history will judge Israeli media for its role in maintaining the occupation. But anything which was relevant until the 7th of October 2023 just intensified 100 times more after the 7th October of 2023. The 7th of October changed many, many things in Israeli mindset. Again, we will not get into it unless I will be asked, because that's not the topic of our talk today. But it changed also the Israeli media. Not that it was before very faithful to truth and very objective, but what happened after the 7th turned the media, almost all of it, into another propaganda channel, all the mainstream media, and I will elaborate on this. But first I would like to emphasize, and that's very important, the Israeli media is a free media. It's mostly private-owned media with commercial considerations. There is a military censorship in Israel, but it's very limited in last years. Israeli media has the freedom of speech, has the freedom to publish almost anything it wants. And that's very, very important, because it makes my criticism of the Israeli media much harsher. You see, the Russian media is covering in a very similar way the war in Ukraine, very similar to the Israeli media. But there is one major difference, and this difference is not in favor of the Israeli media. The Israeli media could have covered it in a different way. The Russian media, I'm not so sure, because Russia is not a democracy and Israel is a democracy, or at least it is a democracy for its Jewish citizens. And in any case, it is perceived as a democracy, and it was a democracy, and it still is, even though a democracy with many cracks in the recent year, but still it can be considered as a democracy for its Jewish citizens. And again, I will not get into the problems of Israeli democracy. But in this framework, Israeli media could have really do its job. It's not about political attitudes. I think that most of Israeli journalists are not supportive of the Netanyahu government, are not supportive of the occupation. There were years in which the right-wingers used to criticize Israeli media and call it a leftist mafia, or at least it is run by a leftist mafia. Most of the journalists would be defined as liberal Zionists, as leftist Zionists, It's not a problem of their personal views. They are irrelevant. The real betrayal of the Israeli media in the last year is a professional betrayal. Because media, according to what I was taught, has a role. It's not another business. It has a political role, it has a social role, it has a major role in the network of a democracy, of a democratic regime. There is no democratic regime without free press, it doesn't exist. And the betrayal of the Israeli media in the last year is a double betrayal. Everything that happened in this year is a continuous of what happened before, because the Israeli media does not cover the Israeli occupation in a professional way for decades. It's not like things changed dramatically. It was only intensified and for the bad. And let me get directly to the heart of the problems, and there are two. The Israeli media is reporting now 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I mean, almost all TV programs and radio programs are news programs. Very little is for other things. We are in war. We are losing soldiers on a daily basis. There are Israelis who are evacuated from their homes, many tragedies, and above all, we are carrying the trauma of the 7th of October, which was a genuine trauma with hundreds and hundreds of innocent killed people in one day, a fiasco, a scene that Israel had never witnessed before, a real barbaric scene with really atrocities that cannot happen and shouldn't have happened. But in this year, Israel is totally concentrated in the war in a very natural way, and may I say in the wars, because we have at least two fronts, if not many more, but the major two fronts are in the north with Hezbollah and in Gaza with Hamas. And the reports are daily, every hour. And here comes the problems. The first problem is that if one of you would have watched Israeli TV or opened the mainstream Israeli newspapers, except of mine, you wouldn't believe to what you see. You will see only coverage of the Israeli victims, the Israeli brave soldiers, the Israeli justifications, the casualties, the tragedies. Again and again, the Israeli media is still telling the story of the 7th of October on a daily basis. There's not a single day in which the Israeli media does not get back to what happened on the 7th of October and tell it again and again throughout victims, throughout investigations of what happened there, throughout the families of the hostages, which are now a major factor in Israeli daily life. Over 100 hostages are still in captivity in Gaza. Most of them are unfortunately not alive, but we don't know how many of them. But for sure, some of them are alive, and they are still stuck there over 400 days now. This is almost the entire content of Israeli media, telling the story of ourselves, telling the story of our sacrifice, telling the story of our victims, telling the story of our bravery. There's only one thing which is absent here, and this is the Palestinian side. Now, the Palestinian side is absent in Israeli media for decades. If it is present, it is always present in a biased way, either demonized or dehumanized on a systematical level. It's not here and there some incident. That's the mindset. That's the zeitgeist, the spirit of this period, of the time. in Israel, not to perceive and not to present the Palestinians as equal human beings, much before this war, not to portray them as human beings like us, not to tell their story, not to tell their narrative, not to tell their tragedy, and if yes, in a very minimal way, just as a lip service here and there. The main example starts many years ago, the Nakba, the Palestinian tragedy of 1948, when over 600,000 Palestinians were expelled forever from their villages, from their lands, from their property, from their families, forever. I, who grew up in Israel, I heard the word Nakba maybe the first time when I was 20, 25, many, many years after 48. We didn't hear about it. Nobody told us about it. The media ignored it. All kinds of lies were told to us. Again, I will not get into details, but we used to see ruins on the side of the roads, and we never asked who was living in those ruins. Where are those people? What happened to them? What did we do to them? Nothing of this, as a child, as a teenager, and as an adult. And then came the occupation of 67, and things became even worse. The media decided not only to take side, but systematically to dehumanize the Palestinians. It did it not because of ideology. It did it because this is what the Israelis want to know. I truly believe that the Israelis, who are by no chance, they are not monsters, they are regular people, some of them with more conscious, some of them with less conscious, like any other society, and not worse than any other society. But those people couldn't have lived in peace if they would have known everything that happens ever since 48 until today. I can't believe that an honest Israeli could have lived in peace with it. I can't believe that an average Israeli couldn't live without moral doubts, at least, about what we are doing to the other people for so many years, systematically. Some of it with justification, and some of it without justification. My claim is that you might be in favor of the occupation. You might say that Israel has no other chance. You might say that everything that Israel is doing is self-defense. You might say that Israel wouldn't have done it if there wouldn't be terror. You might find all the justifications in the world. What is unacceptable is that you will not know what Israel is doing. And that's the situation. There is a black hole in Israeli media, which is very courageous in many other fields. Presidents, prime ministers, and ministers, and members of parliament, and even a chief rabbi all went to jail because of investigations of the Israeli media. Really, some of those investigations were courageous, professional, and free. But when it comes to covering the occupation, there is a black hole in Israeli media. Namely, we know what you expect from us. We will not bother you too much. We know you love our soldiers. We will not show you everything they are doing. We know you love our army. We will not show you everything that the army is doing. We will let you believe in what you are told, that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, is the most moral army in the world. Try to tell an Israeli that the Israeli army is not the most moral army, but the second moral army in the world. They will be so offended. How dare you? We, the media, will supply you with support, with encouragement, even though it will be involved with lies, with hiding half of the truth, with ignoring. Some of you are students of journalism. Most of you, I guess, of our listeners and viewers. So you know by now that a lot about journalism is about framing. The information might be delivered, but the only question is, how do you deliver? I gave once an example in which people were very mad at me, but it was a real example from the former war in Gaza, not from this one. There were 2 dogs killed in the former war in Gaza in 2014, 2 Israeli dogs, one with the troops and one in a villa in the south of Israel from a rocket. Both dogs got front page coverage in Israeli popular media. Their photos, their names, their funerals, even tears of soldiers who were fighting with with one of those dogs. I'm a dog lover, believe me, the dogs deserve everything. But in those very same days, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of Palestinians killed. On those very same days when the dogs were killed. They got 2 lines in the newspaper, without names, without any human sign, without ages, without their story, nothing. You would find a small story today, 25 Palestinians were killed in Gaza. Yesterday, 45 Palestinians were killed in Gaza, and that's it. When this is the framing, you can't create any kind of emotional involvement. It is like statistics, doesn't tell you anything. Throughout those years of occupation, which is quite brutal, I must tell you, and becoming more and more brutal, you hardly got the stories of the occupation in Israeli mainstream media. Not about the land confiscations, not about the killings, not about the arrests, not about the humiliation, the searches at night, nothing of this. I mean, an average Israeli never met a Palestinian, even though he lives half an hour away from the occupied territories. An average young Israeli never met a Palestinian. He has no interest in him, and he doesn't know anything about his life under Israeli occupation. Nothing. The Israeli media even invented a special language to make it softer, to make it more adjustable. Take, for example, the concept of detainees without trial. We have now thousands of detainees without trial, Palestinians, who go to jail for months and months and years without a trial, without charges, without knowing when will they ever be released. There's no democracy in the world who has such a punishment. But Israeli media will not call it a detention without trial, which is the right way to call it. They call it administrative detentions. You know, it's very soft, administrative detentions. I remember one editor in Haaretz once asked me, what does it mean, administrative detention? Does it mean in better conditions? And he didn't know. This was many years ago. The Israeli media is adopting all the language of the army, again, in order to make it easier for our consumers to digest this horror of the Israeli occupation. And then came the 7th of October, and everything was intensified. You hardly see the suffer of Gaza. You hardly see people in Gaza. Israeli journalists are not allowed into Gaza for the last 18 years by Israeli government, including obviously me, who used to go there on a daily basis. And those who go to Gaza can only do it now together with the army, which is everything but journalism. The other day, Israel was very stormed from a report, the first report after 1 year, in which you could see the victims, those horrible refugees who are moved from one place to the other in Gaza, starving, thirsty, part of them handicapped, going on the sand, in a terrible fear that they will be bombed in any moment, and they are bombed in any moment. And the journalist who was allowed to do it went with the soldiers to interview them. And he got a long, long documentary in which one refugee after the other confessed and told the camera, "We hate Hamas, we hate Hamas. We love you, Israel, come back to occupy us." One after the other. And one after the other asked, after finishing its role, for a bottle of water, if it's possible. It was a horrifying scene in Israeli media, in the mainstream Israeli TV. I was ashamed. It was in two parts. There were soldiers with guns in those interviews. Those people didn't speak like this with CNN. The same people, the same refugees. They said what was expected from them to say, and the Israeli propaganda was celebrating. You see, they by themselves hate Hamas. Now, there is hatred to Hamas among people in Gaza, no doubt about it. But is this journalism with soldiers with guns directing at those poor people who are afraid of every step, to interview them in those conditions by the biggest and most popular Israeli TV station, and to use this as revealing the truth about Gaza? This was pure propaganda. And no journalist with some kind of dignity and professional criteria shouldn't have done this. By all means not. So the first problem of Israeli media in this year is, as I said, was hiding the truth, changing the truth, changing reality. It's not that they tell lies, they just don't tell the whole truth. They hide the dark side of the moon, they hide the dark side of this war, and the dark side of this war are 20,000 children and women who were killed there. The dark side of this war are 2 million people who are totally homeless without anything, who are wandering from one place to the other in the Gaza Strip. This dark side Israelis are not exposed to. And if they are exposed to it, will be always a clip of 20 seconds, and we go back to our victims, to our soldiers, to our sacrifice. That's not journalism, that's propaganda and brainwashing. The second problem of Israeli media in this year is that Israeli media is bringing only one voice to the studios. We have endless panels now. Day and night, everyone is an expert, everyone is a general, everyone is a military expert, everyone is an intelligence expert, everyone is an expert for Palestinian issues. The studios are exploding from experts and commentators, but they all say the same. No alternative view is being heard. And let me be personal. For years, I used to participate in those panels. In the last year, I was called twice to Israeli TV, only twice. I am almost on a daily basis in Al Jazeera and CNN and BBC, you name it. Israeli TV will not bring an alternative voice, will not bring a critical voice. And again, they do it voluntarily. And again, they do it not because the government doesn't allow, not because the secret services are in front of their studios, not because the military might take over, not at all. They do it only because of commercial reasons and calculations. As one of the hosts of one of those main panels told me, and we are friends, and we are still friends, he told me, Gideon, I cannot bring you now. The watch, I will lose my rating. They will not accept it. It's unacceptable that you will come now. We will meet after the war again. And he is the most liberal host in Israeli TV. Really most liberal host in Israeli TV. So bringing only one voice, one opinion, is first of all very boring. But let's alone the being bored. It is again not journalism. It's again a betrayal of our mission to bring a variety of voices. I mean, when do you judge a democracy? When everything is good and peaceful? No, now it's the time to judge a democracy. But in Israel, there are too many people who think that Israel is a too democratic state. I will never forget, I was once in a former war in Gaza. I was hosted by Haaretz in the BBC, in BBC World Service, on TV. And we were walking, the host and I were walking along the promenade of Tel Aviv, and people who recognized me came and said all kinds of things. I will never forget one woman who told the host, she told him, you know what's the problem? We have too much democracy in Israel. Half of the world is fighting for democracy. And here in Israel, the feeling is that we have too much democracy because people like me are not in jail. So I don't want to get into too personal thing because I'm really not the story, by all means not. But Israelis don't want to hear another view. Not only they don't want, they don't tolerate now another view. Because after the 7th of October, few basic things happened in Israeli public opinion, and the media is not ready to ignore them. Namely, beyond the shock and the mourning and the trauma and the suffer, beyond this, most of the Israelis, if not all of them, truly believe that after the 7th of October, Israel has the right to do whatever it wants. After the 7th of October, most of the Israelis, if not all of them, don't believe anymore that the Palestinians are human beings. For them, they are all the rapists and the murderers from the 7th of October, all of them. And they are not ready to accept that that's not the case. They are not ready to accept reality. So in this mindset, in this atmosphere, Israelis are not ready to hear any kind of even reports about the suffer of the Palestinians in Gaza. Not to say, don't you dare to pay any kind of pain, empathy, sympathy, solidarity, understanding. Don't you dare. The General Secretary of the UN, just in the beginning of this war, said that the 7th of October has a context. He was declared an anti-Semite. Do you really believe that there is no context for the 7th of October? Do you really believe that everything has no context? By saying there is a context, you don't justify. But if you want to solve a problem, you have to get to its roots. You have to understand why things are happening. But in Israel, no room for this, not after the 7th of October. Israelis are not ready to hear anything which will portray the Palestinian suffer in Gaza as a human suffer. They're not ready for this. They don't accept it. My publisher, Amos Shokin, who is already third generation of German Jews who run Haaretz, a real Democrat and liberal, he is almost 80 now. He said 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, in a Haaretz conference in London, that the Palestinians are called terrorists in Israel, but they are freedom fighters. The same day, we lost, I can reveal here a small secret, we lost over 1,500 subscribers in one day because of what he said. And this is Haaretz leadership, which is so different than the average, because Haaretz is still the only outlet which gives you much more about the occupation, much more about the suffering in Gaza, much more about the crimes of war, much more about what the Israeli soldiers are really doing. But Israel is not ready for this, and the media is going along those lines. I don't want to take too much of the time because I passed already my time, so I would like just to say some concluding remarks, and then I'll obviously be so happy to answer questions. We are not dealing now, and I repeat it, but it's important to stress it, especially for those who are students of journalism. By the way, an excellent choice for lifetime to become a journalist. Let me recommend you, after 40 years of journalism, that this was my best choice in life, except of my wife. And in this framework, I would like to say one thing. We are not dealing with political views. We are dealing with professional criteria. And there are professional criteria for journalism. Journalism is not another business, even though it's private owned, most of it today. But it's not only a business which has to make money. If we perceive it like this, that's the end of democracy, no less than this. Media has a role, a social and political role, and we cannot betray it. Exactly like the politicians cannot betray their role, we journalists cannot betray our role in a democracy. And if we do so voluntarily, the guilt is much stronger and unacceptable. Right now, everyone is happy about the coverage of the war in Israel, or almost everybody is happy. But I think that one day people will ask, on those dark, very dark days, and we are facing very dark days in Israel, and obviously in Palestine. But one day someone will ask, where have you been, journalists? Why didn't you tell us the whole story? Why didn't you tell us what every European, Canadian, or American knows by now? And then maybe Israeli journalists will be ashamed. Until then, I'm trying, me and my newspaper, to do this really ungrateful job of trying to be different, trying to fulfill our duty, not because of political motivation, because of pure professional commitment to this important mission that we took upon ourselves as journalists. Thank you very much.
Gideon Levy, thank you very much for your comments. We have a lot of questions from the audience, but there are a few that I would like to ask first. You describe in detail, an Israeli media system where journalists, as you say, and news outlets willingly self-censor. And the obvious first question that kind of occurs to me is that if that's the prevailing environment, how is it that you are still published?
It's quite simple to answer this. First of all, I don't take it for granted, and I don't know for how long it will continue, because if this government will continue and this mindset will continue to prevail, I can't take it for granted. Secondly, I'm privileged to be Jewish, and in Israel it is a privilege. And thirdly, which is most important, I have Haaretz as my platform. And Haaretz is still a respected newspaper, even though in this year there are also many politicians who would love to see Haaretz being closed down. And I'm not sure we are not going to face it very soon. They closed Al Jazeera, they might close Haaretz. Not today, in half a year, in 1 year, but things are in the air. New legislations are in the air. But meanwhile, we survive, and I can continue with full freedom. I can express myself totally in freedom. And yes, those are the remains of the liberal democracy of Israel for its Jewish citizens.
So could you talk a little bit about what you think makes you see the world differently from other Israeli journalists whom you criticize? Is it personal experience? Is it political belief? Is it I'm just curious what it is that differentiates you from the journalists you criticize.
So you mentioned yourself there is not one reason for this, but there is a main reason for this. In the year of 1988, I decided gradually and not with special intention to start to cover the Israeli occupation. And ever since then, I'm traveling at least once a week to the occupied territories, until 18 years ago also to Gaza, now only to the West Bank. Until this very moment, at least once a week I go there. And I'm covering it for so many years, every week after week, telling the crimes, reporting the crimes, investigating the crimes. And gradually, I changed my views because I saw in my own eyes what we are doing to another people who lives in this same piece of land and should have had the same rights on this piece of land. So my views, I wasn't born with those views. I was a very good boy in Tel Aviv. I served in the army, as you mentioned. I worked with Shimon Peres. I mean, I was part of the establishment of the Zionist establishment. It's only what I saw throughout the years, gradually made me different. No other journalist did this journey. And therefore, no other journalist, or almost, I don't want to say no other, there is Amir Ahas, the legendary, who lives in Ramallah for years, he who lived in Gaza before. But not many Israeli journalists did this journey that I took upon myself.
Yeah.
It's not that I am a better person. I just went in a different way.
Yeah. That bearing witness aspect of journalism that you're talking about, like personal observation, I would imagine that that's a far more delicate task in today's environment. And yet you keep returning to the West Bank if you're not able to go to Gaza. Yesterday, we heard from, as we mentioned, Shuruk Al-Ayla, who is a journalist who works in Gaza, and she spoke eloquently about her frustration of not being able to convey certain things through her coverage. For example, the way it might smell or feel like after an airstrike. I wonder what it must be. You say you've been on Israeli television twice, and you write these columns. I wonder what it's like for you, how frustrating it is for you to know that your coverage, your approach is not taken in the way you might hope it would be.
It's very frustrating, and even more so now. My only comfort is that in English, I'm much more read than in Hebrew, even though for me the main direct target are the Israeli readers, because to them I'm talking. But the fact that Haaretz is published in both languages gives me a different perspective outside. But within Israel, it's very, very, very frustrating. I know that people don't read it, and less so. I know that people are very angry that it exists at all, or I exist at all. I know that people are not open to hear different voices. But I continue because what choice do I have? But it's very frustrating.
I think because we have a fair number of questions from the audience, I'm going to mix some of those within the questions that I have for you.
Sure.
So here's one from the audience who's watching us on YouTube. And just for those who are watching, you can add your question if you scan the QR code and to get to the Slido app, and that gets you the forum for questions. So the question here is, Gideon briefly alluded to a privilege of being a Jewish journalist in Israel. Is there a distinction between being a Jewish journalist and an Arab journalist? That's the question from the audience.
I can't even find one common thing between an Israeli Jewish journalist and a Palestinian journalist. Even though I must say that in my newspaper there are now few Palestinian journalists, Israeli Palestinians. Maybe for the knowledge of those who don't know, we have different kinds of Palestinians. We have the Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza, and they don't have the Israeli citizenship. They don't have any citizenship, no rights, totally oppressed, and they live under the Israeli occupation. And we have 20% of the citizens of Israel are also Palestinians. But they have full citizenship, they can vote for the parliament, they can be elected, and they have at least a formal democracy. But even they are now shut down in the last year. They don't dare, most of them, to express their views because the police and the secret services are after them. Any expression of empathy to the Palestinians in Facebook or in any other social media, really, you just say, oh, look at those poor children, and the police is in your door, and you might lose your job, and you might be arrested. So they work, even the journalists, they work in a different atmosphere. Me, as a Jewish journalist, as I say, I still gain this privilege of being Jewish in a state which is based on Jewish supremacy. That's the idea of a Jewish state. There are 20% Palestinians and another 5 million Palestinians in occupation, and you call yourself a Jewish state. It means there is a Jewish supremacy. I'm part of the supremacy.
Question from me this time. I am curious, actually, where do you get your news about Gaza? How do you follow what's happening in Gaza?
Look, everyone who wants to know what's going on in Gaza can do it.
So
you just go. Yeah. You
so,
just. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I can't go there, which for me is really, I mean, not only from the war, from the last 18 years. It's a piece of land that I was very attached to the people there. I have friends there. I had really some of my best stories there. They are very different from the West Bankers. They are really special people in Gaza, and I will not get into it, but they are, if you ask me about one place I would like to visit in the world, it will be Gaza. 1 hour away from my home, 1 hour and 15 minutes drive.
Yeah.
And I can't get there.
The reason I ask, I'll just interject here, is because you make a good point, is that, beyond the mainstream media, social media has disrupted the mainstream media model, like you have, and allowed people in Gaza, for instance, to tell their own stories. And there's an extraordinary amount of information coming out of those communities, as Sharuk called it yesterday, a live streamed conflict. So it seems that there's something else at play here beyond the Israeli media's self-censorship. It's leading Israelis, or some Israelis, to not knowing the reality of occupation or this conflict that's going on. What is it?
It is this wall-to-wall coalition in Israeli society of not wanting to know. It is the government and the army and the secret services who don't want you to know, but it is the citizens who don't want to know. You think it is comfortable to open Al Jazeera and to see dozens of dead children's bodies in a pile, knowing that your son or the friends of your son did it? It's not very convenient. So the best thing is not to look there. And the media is making it easier. If you want, you can know everything about Gaza, even from Israel, but you have to want. And most of us don't want to know and don't want even to hear about it, because then you face a real dissonance. This is me, this is Israel, those are the Israelis, that's the way we are being looked upon.
Another question from the audience, kind of connected to all this, is how do you suggest reporters cover conflict when it impacts their personal lives? Does detached observer still apply? And I guess the sort of the connected question is, you alluded to this. The attack on Israel, by Hamas on October 7th was unprecedented. And, to use your words, the images and the stories were horrific on that day. I guess I'm wondering, you said more than once that this isn't about political views on the part of Israeli media. That what makes you so sure that this isn't about Israeli journalists just having the same feelings as other Israelis, that this attack deserves or necessitates the response that is going on right now?
It has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. You might think that Israel has the right to do whatever it wants, that there are no limits, that the Palestinians deserve it, that they are to be blamed for it. It's all legitimate. What is not legitimate is that you will not know what is happening to them. Now, the 7th of October was obviously on the 7th of October. On the 9th of October, I was already in the south, 48 hours after. And I saw horrible scenes, and then I kept on going there because it was very important for me to see what was really happening. There were still bodies in the kibbutzim. There were dead dogs in the entrance of the houses. Blood was everywhere. Fire was everywhere. It was really horrible. And I felt a lot about it. And in those kibbutzim, there were the most faithful Haaretz. This was really the Israeli peace camp in those kibbutzim, leftist kibbutzim. Wonderful people. Yes, emotionally, it was very hard to see it. But first of all, a journalist is not motivated only by his emotions. And secondly, what's the connection? This happened, and it is horrible. And what we did ever since then is 100 times more horrible, and it's not justified. You might think it is justified, okay, but at least tell us, show us what is going on.
Is it possible that what you're describing is something that perhaps isn't unique to Israel, but what always happens in war? That people will seek out stories that kind of confirm that they're on the right side, or then they avoid anything that, or challenge stories that don't accord with their own views.
We had one famous Israeli journalist who wrote an article under the title, "Be silent, we are shooting." In other words, when we are in war, no critics, no different opinions, no alternative voices. We are in war now, and the media should recruit itself. I don't accept it. If we will not criticize now, when will we criticize? After the war will be over? I think that the same ethic rules which are in days of peace are also relevant in days of war. Journalists are not combats, they are not soldiers, they are not troops, they are journalists, and they should continue their job exactly like before the war. I can understand that Israeli will cover differently losses of Israeli soldiers rather than Palestinians. I don't accept it to be totally neutral. You can't be neutral in a war. But on the other hand, you cannot totally forget your compass and cover only one side. This is unacceptable and not professional.
In the past, you've described yourself as an Israeli patriot. I'm wondering how you balance those two things, fierce criticism of the Israeli state and a proud connection to the country.
Look, I've been in some wars in the world. I've been to Sarajevo, I've been to Georgia. I remember in Sarajevo, I saw horrible things. But it was not part of me. I was not attached. In the beginning, I didn't know who are the bad ones, who are the good ones, but this doesn't matter. It was not part of me. I'm attached to this place not less than the most extreme right-winger in Israel. I care about this place not less than any other Israeli. I was born here. I will never leave Israel. I'm part of Israel. And in this way, I meant that I'm a patriot because I care about Israel. But I want to live in a just place, and I don't. And that's my struggle. But it has nothing to do with being a patriot or not. I think the real patriot is the one who cares about his homeland. And nobody can deny that I don't care about Israel. I think that Israel should deserve punishment, deserve sanctions. Yes, very harsh things, but all in order to make it a better place.
Another audience question. They're wondering, as a result of what you do and the expressions you make in your columns, is Haaretz at risk, or are you at risk? I remember you once had to move around with bodyguards.
Yeah, in 2014, I had bodyguards because the threats were there, more concrete and more violent, I guess. I had also some incidents which almost became violent. I don't know to explain it, but this time I feel much more secure, even though I get insults in the streets, but not like in 2014. I don't think I'm in risk. You know, being in risk is something that many times you think you are in risk and you are not, and many times you feel safe and you are in big risk. Who knows? Haaretz is in risk mainly because I'm afraid that Israeli politicians will do anything possible to close it down. It will not be simple, and it's not for the coming weeks or months. But the process which started with Al Jazeera will get also to Haaretz. I'll give you one example. Some of the right-wingers spoke at the time about legislation which will not enable journalists to criticize the army. Can you believe it? I think it will get a majority in Israeli politics and also in Israeli public opinion. Most of the Israelis don't want to hear criticism about the army and about the soldiers. Imagine yourself Haaretz without being able to criticize the army. I mean, I can close my computer and retire in such a case. So the threat is there. It is in the air. But more from the direction of the government. Here it is more from the politician than from the street. The street doesn't like us, but still we survived quite nicely for so many years. Haaretz is the oldest Israeli newspaper.
Can you talk about that file in the Haaretz office that has your name on it?
Not anymore, because now it's all in the computer. So this file is archaeology. Once they used to keep all the letters and the cancellations of subscribers because of me, and it used to be, I once opened some drawer or something in the office, and I realized it's a huge volume of letters and cancellations, but now it's all being done online. I can just tell you that for me, the most dangerous place is the subscribers department, the marketing department of Haaretz. I better don't pass there because they for sure don't like me. But I'm not the story. It's not that I try to be modest, but I'm really not the story. I'm not important enough to be a story.
So then I guess that one of the stories that, the $10 million question is, what has to happen? This is an audience question. What has to happen for this to change? I presume this meaning, this self-censorship among the media. Do you see a way forward? Was there ever a way forward? That's what this audience member asked.
Fortunately, I'm very pessimistic, mainly because in a very interesting way, the young generation in Israel is much more extreme and right-wing and nationalistic and anti-democratic than the older generation. It's the opposite way than in many other countries. The young people in Israel are much more nationalistic, and polls show it. So there will be no hope from the next generation. they are even more anti-democratic. You will hear young people talking about death penalties to terrorists, about expelling Palestinians, about transfer, horrible things. And also the ignorance after so many years of brainwash and lack of information. They are much more ignorant than our generation. They know nothing about the Palestinians, about the occupation. They know nothing. I'm shocked so many times from questions, really, the most basic thing that I'm sure each of you know, and an average Israeli young guy has no clue about. So from this direction, I'm not optimistic. On the other hand, I still count on a different reality when the international community will decide to intervene. But unfortunately, the new American administration is promising exactly the opposite. So we will have to wait even with this hope for at least another 4 years.
I guess the follow-up to that is, as you say, we live in a post-truth environment, whether we like it or not, in all parts of the world. And the question really is that compass that you're talking about that should be guiding journalists, is that an antiquated notion in today's environment? Is that recoverable in today's environment? Not just in Israel, but writ large.
I guess you can answer this question maybe even better than me, but no less good than me. I really don't know. The social media are very destructive, very, very destructive. And we know that they shape the next generation. In the social media, there are no criteria. There is no professional consideration, fake news. I mean, you really don't know what is real and what is fake. Now we are getting the AI, and it will be a situation in which you will see a video, which was always the ultimate proof. And now you'll see a video and you will have no clue if it's real or fake. Those things are very, very, very destructive for journalism. Because by the end of the day, there will be no truth. And there is a truth. It's not true that there is no truth. There is a very clear truth, even in things which seem to be very vague or very unclear. Finally, there is a basic truth to everything. And the social media disturbs even this.
So jumping off from that answer, Gideon, I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about, I know, as we mentioned earlier, you visit the West Bank regularly. What do you hear from people there? Like, what do you hope to learn when you go there on a regular basis?
So first of all, I go only to victims. I don't meet politicians. I don't meet intellectuals. It's really the grassroots. Refugees in refugee camps, in villages, peasants, shepherds, really the most simple people who pay, as usual, the highest price. And I do it, every week for so many years. And I'm always astonished, but nobody believes me. But I can tell you with a lot of confidence, the Palestinians want peace much more than Israel. They would have loved to live with us, while most of the Israelis don't want to live with them. Even the Israeli leftists speak about we are here and they are there. They speak about separation. The average Palestinian would have loved to live together with the Israelis, but in equal terms, with dignity. Not like now, obviously not. But I see much more hatred here than I see there.
Another question from the audience. It's about actually how Western media cover the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I'm actually, maybe before I ask that question, I know you read a lot of Western sources covering this story. I'm wondering what you think are some of the key things that the Western press miss about the story of this ongoing conflict.
First of all, the Western media, if you can speak about Western media as one entity, is doing much a better job than the Israeli media, obviously. I must tell you, I was never a fan of CNN. In this war, I'm watching CNN. Now they're all in the elections and the new administration, so there's no room for Gaza or for Lebanon. But before the elections, they did a very fair job. And Al Jazeera in English, the only international outlet who has reporters in Gaza, the only one who has reporters in Gaza, deals with it in a very fair way. You will be surprised, but the main problem is now in Western media in some countries, maybe also in your country, that the Israeli strategy is now to label any criticism about Israel as anti-Semitism. And you see that journalists don't dare to criticize Israel. And editors don't dare to publish critical things against Israel.
So what's your view of that? What is your view of that description of criticism of Israel's policies?
I think that there is anti-Semitism which must be fought, but most of the critics of Israel are not anti-Semites. They are people of conscience. How can you not criticize Israel when you see 20,000 killed women and children? I mean, how else can you react if not being shocked and blame those who are responsible and those who commit those crimes? So this propaganda strategy of manipulating the West by labeling it as anti-Semite is very efficient. Why isn't it allowed? Why is it a crime to say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free? You might agree to it, you might not. But to avoid it by law, to prohibit it by law, and you hear it more and more that this slogan will soon not be legal. What is it? And you see it more and more in Europe, obviously, but also in the United States, and I guess also in your country. And this is unacceptable. That's really a problem of freedom of speech, not a problem of anti-Semitism. And again, I stress, anti-Semitism should be fought, and there is anti-Semitism. But don't mix one with the other.
So just going back to the question that prompted all of this, the audience member is asking, how can Canadian-based reporters, and presumably that could apply to any country outside of Israel, but how can Canadian-based reporters tell better stories of what's happening in the Middle East when most don't understand the political or geographic situation in that region?
First of all, I don't know if most don't understand, and the media is there to explain. It's not so complicated. And I think the level of knowledge, my impression is that the level of knowledge about the Middle East is by far bigger than most of the conflicts today in the world. Because the media is dealing with this conflict for so many years, and it is so central. Imagine yourself, what do we know, or what do Canadians know about the conflict in Sudan, or the conflict in Myanmar? About Middle East, we know much more, and those who have interest know. Those who don't have interest and will not know. But those who are curious to know can easily know. And I think that the level of knowledge is not the problem. The level of knowledge of most of the societies in the West, for sure, is a very fair level. I wish Israelis would have known so much.
Just a couple more questions before we wrap up, Gideon. One is what is a key bit of advice you might offer emerging journalists, or frankly any journalists, on navigating a story or covering a story that is so polarizing?
I don't want to sound as using cliches, but really follow your conscience. I really remember going to Sarajevo, covering the war there. I had no clue. The editor called me, go to Sarajevo. I knew nothing about the war, the siege of Sarajevo, the war in Bosnia. I hardly knew what's the difference between the Serbs and the Muslims and the Croats and the Slovenians, nothing. So I went with an open heart and open eye. And slowly, by staying there, I started to, but first of all, I covered what I see. And that's always very easy. And when I was in Sarajevo under siege, I covered first of all the suffer, the unbelievable suffer of the people of Sarajevo. I covered the daily life in Sarajevo before getting into politics even. And I really thought, is it acceptable that in Europe this reality is going on for months and years, in which I saw old women digging in the ground to find some roots, to have something to eat? So first of all, open your eyes before anything else. Even if you don't have to have your opinion here. First of all, tell us what you see and what you hear. Describe the reality. That's the first step, I think. This is what I did.
Final thing, I was just curious, Gideon, I'm assuming you've written a column today. I'm just wondering what the topic is for tomorrow's paper.
It was not published yet. It will be published only tomorrow morning. The title is The Enemies of Israel, or The New Enemies of Israel. And it is aimed at the new administration in the United States, with unbelievable nominations which make the Israeli right-wingers as moderates. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's like a farce. The biggest friends of the settlement project, the biggest friends of the ultra right-wingers in Israel, are becoming Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense and the National Advisor and Ambassador to Israel. And I think that they are enemies of Israel, because they will really let Israel go wild. If until now there were some restraints on Israel, now there will be no restraints. Who will stop now Israel from sending settlers to Gaza? Nobody. Soon you'll see settlements in Gaza. And if you think that this is friendship, ask yourself if you have a relative or a friend who is a drug addict. Supplying him with more money is friendship? Not at all. And this is what those friends are doing. They are supplying Israel with more green light to commit crimes. And that's not friendship in my view. That's really dangerous.
Gideon, those are the questions that we have for you. Thank you very much for taking them, and thanks for your comments today. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a great pleasure and honor to be with you tonight.
I'll hand it back to Alan.
Thank you, Nahlah. That brings our event to a close. Before we depart, let me thank all of those who helped make this event happen. Our partners at CBC Ideas, the Stursberg family, my colleagues at Carleton and in our production team, and of course, our moderator, Nahlah Ayed. But most of all, Gideon, I just have to thank you, journalist to journalist, for the contribution that you are making at great personal cost to our understanding of what is happening in Gaza and the occupied territories and in Israel. I really do hope we can meet in person sometime. What you have given us today, and I really appreciated your linkage to Peter Stursberg and that era of war correspondence, but also the times when you spoke directly to journalism students and those who want to do this job. You gave us a textbook lesson, I think, in journalism ethics and standards. Accountability, humanity, a search for the truth, and the importance of a moral voice. Most of all, I want to thank you for your honest reporting. And honest reporting is a term that shouldn't be abused. And I think you've shown us what it really means. So thank you. And with that, just want to thank all those who have attended, who've watched today. If you want to follow up and see a recording of this event, it will be available on the School of Journalism website. And any suggestions for next year's topic, I'm all ears. So with that, allow me to bring this afternoon to a close, evening for Gideon, and wish you all a good day.
Thank you very much.